when you log into your TV to watch Netflix, you're going to enter a code. So people are kind of trained, they're conditioned that, oh, I just have to enter this code. It's just part of the authentication flow. So they're used to it. It doesn't seem malicious at all. So it's just been continuous success attackers have had.
Topic du jour, and before we get to the topic, guest du jour. I'm Mitchel Parish, Threat Researcher here at Zscaler. Going to be joining us today. We're going to kind of talk through like platform chaining, phishing. There's going to be a bunch of themes that for those of you who are here regularly, this will kind of actually be, I think it's like, it's a kind of really neat, I think, marrying together or like, vertical integration of a bunch of the things that we're always talking about. So like social engineering, there'll be some device code phishing mixed in here, AI, just a whole bunch of kind of themes. And I think, I'm super excited to see how this kind of all gets stitched together end to end. So Mitchel, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Good to be here.
And before we kind of dive in to the details of this, would be helpful if you could just kind of set the stage for everyone in terms of like why we're talking about this in the first place. Like what does this look like in terms of prevalence? Relatively speaking, how busy is this keeping the team compared to other things? Kind of like just help folks get their head wrapped around kind of like severity of the problem and just and like how frequently you see it evolving or changing in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so you mentioned device code phishing, and we've seen that kind of explode over the past 6 months. Like, not a new or novel technique at all. But one, I went back and looked, previous 6 months, almost the entire year so far, device code phishing consistently in our top 10 of identity attacks, paired with, like you said, residential proxies as well. So kind of in totality, hard to detect without behavioral and prevalence-based detections. And you mentioned the AI piece as well, like not to throw FUD fire out there, like these aren't agentic attacks. They're AI kind of developed kits and platforms that have kind of lowered the bar for adversaries to conduct phishing operations. We can go ahead and pop to the next slide.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, just so you don't feel bad about invoking AI, it is illegal to go a week ever without talking about that.
Yeah.
But that is, it is interesting. Like there is like some of the FUD aspects to it, but I think that is the one, no, not the one, but I think like, a central and very real theme. And I know like we've talked about it and written about it, and they're going to be publishing some more research on it soon, like is just how much it has lowered costs for adversaries to do new things, obviously, like build net new capabilities, but also like with things like this that are like even remotely social engineering based, like the pace of iteration and like the quality that they're able to crank out in a short amount of time is a very obviously like a very real problem and just puts a bunch of downward pressure on everybody else on the defensive side.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Like you'll see the headlines like agentic driven, and in this case, AI is certainly accelerating the innovation aspect, lowering the bar. Like it's not trying to minimize it at all. Like it's why we're seeing the prevalence of these attacks. I think, like I said, I think the initial research on device code abuse came out in like 2022, and we just started to see in the past year like an explosion of it. And one, the prevalence of these kits, they're cheap. They're sold on the dark net and through Telegram. Anybody can go and essentially buy one of these kits and just, get going. There's also open source tools like GraphSpy that rely on these techniques that red teamers are using as well. And then on top of that, device code feels very similar to what when you log into your TV to watch Netflix, you're going to enter a code. So people are kind of trained, they're conditioned that, oh, I just have to enter this code. It's just part of the authentication flow. So they're used to it. It doesn't seem malicious at all. So it's just been, continuous success attackers have had with these attacks. So I've listed some of the popular platforms there. You'll see a lot of talk about those, especially Kali 365. And then on the primitive side, there on the right, just kind of network signals that we're seeing, in addition to these attacks, like I said, residential proxies are huge right now. Um, they allow adversaries to spoof locations so you can try and get around named locations and something like Contra. So you kind of have to take a look at all of these signals, together to give yourself a really strong signal.
So
Um,
for the the primitive disparities, just is that we've kind of talked before, and I think like some of the folks from the machine learning and like AI team have come on and talked about just like as a defender, like just a great defensive use case for AI is just doing things like being able to baseline. Is that kind of what you're looking at there when you say primitive disparities, meaning like, hey, like Mitchell's typical profile of like phone, computer, browser version, et cetera, like are this, and just kind of looking for drift? Is that kind of the simplest way to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. And correlating those signals across, like Enter's got 3 or 4 different log sources, log types. So correlating those fields across those is super important too. But in a bring your own device mobile work environment, it's like there are signals that we expect to see. There are signals that we shouldn't be super surprised to see. And then there are some signals that are obviously malicious, and it's kind of trying to find those needles in a haystack to actually surface quality detections. That's the
Yeah.
challenge.
Yeah, that is. I know. I think obviously like having a, being able to look at like that data set over time is super powerful. I do feel like that was, it was approachable with a SIM. Definitely feels like, AI and like LLMs in general have maybe made that more accessible for folks. As always, like the harness and the data pipeline, I think are still a challenge for, an individual organization setting that up. Um,
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, tell you what, then let's dig in. I want to talk through like a very real example because I know
yeah,
the premise of this was like abusing trusted platforms and services, and so like I did a great job of kind of pulling together an example of a chain that we've seen, and I think a lot of these will be services that people are used to, but maybe to the point of like you're kind of just talking through device code phishing and just like the psychological, like this is a workflow I think that most folks are used to. So not gonna raise a lot of eyebrows. So yeah, take us through this if you don't mind, and just kind of explain how it works.
yeah. No, exactly. So I'll talk a little bit about device code phishing first. I know we've talked about it until we're blue in the face, but just for those that don't know, device code authorization grants meant for devices um, that are input constrained, like don't have a keyboard. Also for Linux endpoint registration, there are legitimate use cases for the device code. Um, but what we've seen attackers do in device code phishing is they create a user code and a device code. They pull the token endpoint, and then the most important part is they socially engineer the user to then input that code into legitimate Microsoft infrastructure. Um, so the user completes their authentication, they complete MFA, and then the token set that the adversaries get, they carry that MFA claim, they're authorized. Um, and so then essentially the adversary has a token and a refresh token without having to steal session cookies or anything like that. So in this case, the lure came as a legitimate Calendly invite delivered via email. Um, so for the attacker, they opened up a free Calendly account. All you need is the email address, so it's completely anonymous. Legitimate service, good sender reputation on the email side, so it's delivered to your inbox, as a legitimate email. Most folks know Calendly, so they trust it. Opened up the link. It was spoofed to look like a document sharing request from from an outside source saying we'd like to share this document with you. It was themed to the victim environment. So construction company to construction company. So it seemed legitimate. Um, and in this case, the what was neat about this one is the adversary used a feature in Calendly called routing forums. Routing forums, which allows you to kind of ask the user questions and then it routes the user to a specific calendar or specific contact information. Um, you can actually back up one sec.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Yeah, sorry about that.
Um, yeah, based on conditions. So essentially, like the user will answer questions, they'll get routed to the right calendar. Um, But in this case, there was a validation flaw in the Calendly app that allowed the attacker to not put any questions in there. So we'll see it in a minute when we look at the lure, but there's no calendar, there's no questions. It's just a static page, legit Calendly infrastructure with a button on it, essentially.
Huh.
And once the user clicked that, they were taken to a OneDrive branded page hosted on Cloudflare Workers.dev, which is their like serverless platform. But you can host static sites on it by default. It's a native feature. Again, another free service that has great reputation-ish. I'll say ish, not from a security side. Like we see workers.dev, pages.dev abused all the time, but for most folks, they see that and it's not a strong signal. Also TLS termination, like the whole experience looks legit. So the user copied that code that they got from the Calendly invite into this OneDrive branded page. That allowed the adversary to grab the token set. And then they used that token and enter ID to register a new device, which is what eventually got them a primary refresh token. So at that point, adversary has pretty much complete access across anything that user has access to.
And I think, like 1 through 3 in particular, you kind of mentioned, trusted or not is, I guess, like can be a little bit of a loaded term, but like, I kind of always like back up and think about this as from like the service desk or the IT department's perspective. And like, it is completely valid in the sense that like all 3 of the moving parts there are things that most organizations can't simply just wholesale block or cut off, right? Like that would interrupt the experience for a lot of legit use cases, right? And I think that's obviously the constant cat and mouse game with like where to host these lures, where to host these intermediate moving parts, like the Cloudflare serverless stuff in particular is challenging, right? You have like a ton of capability on the hosting side in a service with generally good enough reputation, and like it's really tough to think through like how you would proactively meter that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's like the legitimate infrastructure is the best adversary infrastructure. Just like you said, not like no organization is going to blacklist Calendly for their email, probably. And, it's not just Calendly too. It's pretty much any legitimate service that allows you to send an email or to send a link or to host a page. Like those things are up for grabs.
Yeah, it's definitely a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
Yeah, exactly.
Sweet. So you want to dig in, kind of look a little bit more at the lore?
Yeah, let's do it. Sweet. So like I said, Calendly, legit email invite landing page. You'll see it here in a second. It's one I'm sure everyone's familiar with if you ever try to book an appointment with somebody. The routing form, again, just allows you to kind of automate where your legitimate users would go. Then again, that validation, lack of validation allows for the blank form to make it look legit. So I should say Calendly doesn't yet offer like document sharing as like a primary feature. So it was interesting that the adversaries abuse that validation, lack of validation to make it look like a document sharing request. And that'll make a bit more sense here in a minute. Then yeah, again, Cloudflare Workers and then the Microsoft endpoints are legit. They're the endpoints that you would go to for device code authentication. It's like login.microsoft online, microsoft.com/device login. So these are legitimate endpoints that you're going to see a lot of real device code authentication in your environment. So it's kind of piecing these disparate pieces together to kind of identify what's malicious and what's not. And we can go to the next slide and it'll make a bit more sense as far as the lure goes. So this one, again, looks super legit. If you do read the pros, you can notice some kind of weird things, like share project with you. There's some like language things that would kind of give you a bit of hesitation if you were to read it that closely. That paragraph at the bottom as well.
Yeah, no
to
one
ensure
needs to take
seamless
care of it,
access. Like it's
unfortunately. I think that's the
yeah,
reason all this stuff works, right? Is like
yeah,
getting
yeah,
everything.
exactly. And that blank space is where typically either a calendar would be or a form would be. And that validation, you can go in and create a routing rule and then delete the question, and the routing rule stays the same. So that's what allows that bottom button there, review document here, to actually go to an attacker destination. Um, the OneDrive lure looks super good. Again, this is AI-driven development, so it makes it look so legitimate. This is where the user would copy the verification code. Uh, these are valid for 15 minutes on the Entra side. So if it doesn't work, that's why the new code button is there, and that creates a new code with the device code. So the attacker can still continuously pull for when you authenticate. A lot of these platforms, they're set up for kind of mass phishing. So the admin portal will have, a list of users that we've tried to phish, and every single line will be pulling the device endpoint, waiting for someone to authenticate. So this isn't something where an attacker has to be on the keyboard. They send the phishing lure out to however many people, and then they go and do something else. They come back, they've got tokens ready to go. So pretty autonomous, pretty easy for the attacker. Like I said, there's tons of platforms out here that do this and automate it, and it's just super easy. Like, you don't need to be a technical wizard to deploy these things at all.
Yeah. And that and maybe are you going to talk a little bit about like the more of like the primary versus the refresh token stuff? Because I had some questions about that, but
Yeah, no,
if
we
you're
definitely
gonna,
will.
okay, cool.
Yeah, let's go ahead and hit the next slide and we can talk. I think it's
Oh
the
yeah,
next
for sure.
slide.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
Sweet.
excellent.
Yeah. So in this case, and in many cases, the adversary, they impersonate the authentication broker app. Um, that's part of the family of client IDs, which is a list of first-party Microsoft applications. It's not documented by Microsoft, but it's been well documented by the research community. Um, and I think it's Enterscopes.com is a great resource for that, to kind of see what applications belong to the Foki list. If that's how it's pronounced, I've never heard anybody say it. But essentially, those apps, they're first party, they're not blockable. Um, the device code flow when you're using those applications doesn't raise a consent prompt because they're first party. They're on by default. So essentially, here the attacker impersonated the authentication broker app. They received a token set, and then since it's a Foki app, they can either grab a token from any other application on the Foki list without re-authentication, or they can register a device. The authentication broker is what gives you access to the device registration service. But I should say the Foki list, like I said, you can get access to those first-party apps, Teams, OneDrive, Outlook, SharePoint. So that's why the application broker is kind of the most targeted as far as impersonation that we see, just because the scopes that it does have are quite extensive.
And you
Um,
mentioned before, like the time window those are good for. So like you said, believe you said it was like 15 minutes by default. Um, but what is like, with the ability, I guess, once you've got a device registered and you have some ability to refresh. So like, what's is there a limiting factor on like how long the adversary has to effectively like re-engage, or can they continue to like kind of maintain that foothold indefinitely? Like, do you know where that falls?
I think refresh tokens are 90 days, but what happens is if they get application off good grief, authentication broker access, they can then call the device registration service, like I said, to register a device under their control. And when they register that device, that's when the primary refresh token is going to get minted. And from then on, they can pretty much do whatever.
Yeah, so they can automate refreshing that since they control it completely indefinitely. That's
Exactly.
got it.
Yeah. And then that's when we see they're going to go and they're going to start changing MFA devices. They're going to continue to set up persistence as much as possible. So that's kind of the big persistent step. And that's why we see the authentication broker as kind of the number one targeted application. And what you'll see when they do get those tokens, you'll see a cluster of refresh token events across those Foki apps, because they're trying to enumerate, see what all they have access to. They're trying to grab emails, just whatever they can get. So you'll see the same session ID with a lot of refresh token events across those apps.
And is
So
that anomalous kind of in your experience, in the sense that like just that velocity of events is like a good enough indicator for maybe most organizations, just if they wanted to go hunt for this, or do
yeah,
really basic kind of surfacing, that's useful, like that's a useful cluster?
yeah, you would look at that plus the existence of a device code authentication event prior to,
Okay.
because you would see, interactive logins from a normal user account. You would see them in the morning, maybe start opening a bunch of apps, and so you would see some authentication events across a lot of those first party apps. But in device code phishing, you would see the device code, or the CSMI event, and relate, proceeding to those calls. And
And
that's
then
kind of where,
device registration too, then I assume is also like, that sounds so like that's really the trigger, is like if you see that, pay attention.
yeah, especially if the user agent or any other primitives indicate that it's a Windows or Apple device. Um, with a Linux device, it would be a little less strong of a signal, but then that's again where you would look at some of the other events, and correlate those to kind of identify if it was malicious or not.
There's like a
Um,
joke in a debate we could have right now, which is whether anybody actually uses Linux on the desktop, which will make some subset of people really angry.
yeah, I was told it was the year of the Linux desktop, so I don't know if that's accurate or not.
In the last 20
Uh,
years, man, it's still going strong.
yeah,
Awesome. We got a few minutes left. We pivot into kind of look through kind of like how to, like, I guess some of like the preventative and I guess end of detective controls, which I think would be super useful to walk through. I know we've obviously like, beaten the drum of conditional access and things like that in general here, but like, yeah, so kind of walk us through like these four pillars, if you would.
yeah, I think the most important, other than conditional access, is the user piece. You don't see a lot of user education around device code, or at least I haven't yet. It's not talked about a lot, and I think there could be some value in that. Don't enter codes unless you're the one that has initiated it. So user communication first and foremost. Entra also has continuous access evaluation, which is now on by default. That essentially for evaluates signals for like big, strong indicator events like user account is deleted or disabled, password reset, MFA device is enabled. So that'll then go back and reevaluate some controls against that user, in a continuous way. Trusted location policies, also a big one. So named locations in Entra, protecting your device registration and security info registration. So that would be your like password resets and stuff. Requiring a user to be on network, pretty much would stop this sort of attack in its tracks. Um,
And I
blocking is,
just, oh, sorry, real quick, like just
yeah,
for, and also, as you're kind of talking through those, it's like, it kind of seems like almost any two of these together is actually like really powerful. Like each on their own obviously is important, but it's like, kind of like stacking these controls up. You can just imagine that like a combination of conditional access and trusted location, and or making that a strong condition, right? Like feels like that's a really useful approach. You can't do all of these, but like you might only have to do two to prevent a lot of this from happening.
yeah, 100%. And I think one more on the conditional access side is blocking device code authentication flow for most users. And most users don't need this. So just make an exclusion group, and then block the rest of your users from using this. This will at least, narrow the attack surface for attackers and for what you're, needing to keep track of monitoring wise. And then if you're licensed, making sure that your sign-in risk policies have been defined and applied to users as well. When I used to do assessments against Entra ID environments, that was, we would find gaps in conditional access all the time. So using that what if tool on users to see what policies are being evaluated on their behalf is also a super important and easy thing that you can do.
And also like just in the advent, like I know you mentioned like most places don't need to do this, and I do kind of feel like, with, assuming you've got like mobile device management for probably phones and for things like laptops, like that really should obviate the need to enroll a device from like 99% out. I'm trying to think whether I've actually ever been prompted to do this illegitimately or legitimately. And I just like, other than, the example you gave earlier, which I think is the canonical one, which is like, yeah, I'm used to doing it to sign into Netflix on my TV. Like if this ever happened, if this ever happened to me at work, I would probably take my laptop and just like throw it out the window. Like,
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of where the importance of like, we've kind of surrounded this with the legitimate infrastructure bit, and that's kind of that's the whole point of them doing that, is to make folks feel comfortable in an environment that they're used to. And that one thing that's different is copying and pasting a code. But just like we've seen with like fix attacks, like people aren't shy about it. So
there's a question from the audience I wanted to take live. We could. So there was a question just says, like, does phishing resistant MFA help prevent this? So like, where would that help? Where would that kind of fall short? What's the, like, what's your read on that? If and or like, do we see cases where this succeeds despite phishing resistant MFA? If you know.
yeah, so in this case, phishing resistant MFA won't by itself stop the attack. Like I said, the user is authenticating and completing MFA on their end, so they're actually completing MFA. The token that the attacker gets carries that MFA attestation, so it doesn't prevent it. It can help insert a bit of friction into it. If the user hasn't completed MFA, it's kind of another step that makes them maybe question it. But if they're already logged in and authenticated, it's likely, they're going to get that token without any additional authentication. So never want to say don't do that. Like that should be done for sure for every other attack. But in this instance, it's not a silver bullet.
I think, Drea posted a question to the group, which is just, of the 4 mitigations that are listed, like curious what people are finding the most challenging to implement. Might ask you like a slightly different twist on that question, which is that like of those 4, if you just had to pick one, like if you could only have one thing on this list that you feel like was like the highest leverage, not going to be perfect, but like which one of those would you be? Like if a lot of folks I think are just limited on time. They don't have a lot, like most folks don't have a detection engineering team, and like doing like really deep baselining and stuff like that is still like not super accessible to folks. So like, I don't, yeah. If you had to go for like a radically simple approach, what would it be?
Yeah, I would start with a conditional access policy blocking the device code offlow. I would put it in evaluation mode just to get an idea of, like, most folks aren't keeping an eye on authentication types. So putting that in evaluation mode and just seeing how many users are using that authentication method. And then that'll allow you to say, like, it's not many people, let's go ahead and enable it. And then that blocks this attack vector completely.
And conditional access, right, is kind of like, I mean, we're saying it like it's one thing, but you can chain an unlimited number of conditions in there, which is, I guess, once it exists, like continuing to tighten that up over time, like, is actually a little bit easier, right?
Yeah, no, it's super powerful. It's super granular, and that's also the downside. It's very hard to manage, especially across a large enterprise with a lot of different policies. That's why I liked the blocking device code offlow and then having an exclusion group. That's a very simple policy. You can manage that group through user membership. And yeah, that's kind of the simplest approach to block this.
Awesome. We will take it. Well, we have run right to the end of time. Mitchel, thank you so much, man. This was awesome. Learned a ton about this. in the course of this last half hour, and hopefully everyone else did as well. Yeah, really appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Great to be here.
Awesome. Everyone else, thanks for being here as always. As a reminder, I think we mentioned this last week, but just these things moving forward, videos we posted to the Zscaler YouTube channel, I believe on the same general time frame as we always have. So keep a lookout there, subscribe if you want to keep on top of these in the event that you miss a future episode. And we will see you all next week. Cheers.